welcome everyone. Thanks very much for coming along. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Prof. John Sadler from across the pond, who's very kindly agreed to speak with us today on his relatively new book. I think we can say new, Vice and Psychiatric Diagnosis, which was published last year. So Prof. Sadler he's a director of the program in Ethics in Science and Medicine and the chief of the Division of Ethics in the Department of Psychiatry at University of Texas Southwestern. He is the co-founder and treasurer of the Association for the Advancement of Philosophy and Psychiatry, an organization dedicated to exploring conceptual issues at the interface of psychiatry and philosophy, and is one of 3 executive secretaries on the International Network of Philosophy and Psychiatry. He's also written a fantastic book called Values and Psychiatric Diagnosis, which I would strongly recommend. And I believe until recently, I think for the last 30 odd years, you were the editor for the journal. Now I get the P's muddled up. Psychiatry, Psychology, and Philosophy in some
That's
order.
right. Yes, I was editor up until just this past February when Ferdy von Staden took over.
And I'm aware you're also, I believe you're also editor or involved in the International Perspectives series as well. I'll put some links in the chat to those resources if for those who aren't aware, because that they're all brilliant resources. So without further ado, I'll shut up and hand over.
Okay, so you can go ahead to the next slide, Chris. So again, thanks to Chris Meekum, David Crossley, and the Speculative Psychiatry Group for inviting me. I also like to acknowledge editor Martin Baum and the staff of OUP for their stewardship of this book. And then I do, in terms of conflict of interest, I do earn a modest amount of royalty income for my Oxford University Press publications, one of which centers this event. I joke with everybody and say my Oxford OUP royalties number in the high 3 figures. Next slide. So I have this quote from Simone Weil: "Attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity." And so again, I'm grateful for y'all's generosity here. I like to give a brief overview so you know what I'm talking about. In the first section, I should probably say, as an overview of the overview, I am going to give you bits and pieces of the Vice and Psychiatric Diagnosis book, which numbers over 600 pages. So this is a big read. And so the best I can do is I can't give careful arguments for this, that, or the other point that I make. What I can do is allude to what some of the arguments are or evidence is, and then sort of direct you to pieces of or how these are elaborated in the book. So the way I've parsed out the book is in these 5 areas. The scholarly domain or space of what I call Vapid 2, Vice and Psychiatric Diagnosis 2. You'll understand here in a minute. I give an intellectual history of madness and morality. I talk about the vice mental disorder relationship, or VMDR, and psychopathology. I talk about law and criminal justice perspectives on the VMDR, and then public perceptions and public interests regarding the vice mental disorder relationship. And then I talk about my critical discussions, conclusions, and what appears in the book as 40 theses, which are the big prevailing conclusions and policy implications. Next slide. So the acronym for these 2 books is VAPD, which I call Vapid, which usually gets a chuckle from the audience. There's actually it's going to be a trilogy. The first one was Chris's generous mention of Values in Psychiatric Diagnosis. The second one is Vice and Psychiatric Diagnosis, which was published in December of 24. And then my colleague and I, Michael Laney, are working on a virtue in psychiatric diagnosis book, which we're having great fun with, which addresses epistemic virtues in clinical diagnosis, what we're calling diagnostic virtues, as well as diagnostic vices as exhibited by clinicians. And so while all these books have the vapid moniker, they're quite different in their substance, although, you know, the analysis of values is always a big piece of it. So distinct from Vapid 1, or Values in Psychiatric Diagnosis, Vapid 2 is not primarily a conceptual analytic critique of DSM categories. Rather, it is a variety of philosophical anthropology, examining the history and current use of ideas and practices, considering their significance and meaning. Like cultural anthropology and ethnography science, my version of philosophical anthropology in Vapid 2 is not hypothesis driven. It's an exploration of conceptual worlds and understanding them from various points of view. Indeed, my working viewpoint on the issues in this book, the Vice book, was completely transformed over the years that I did the researching and writing of the book. Okay, next slide. Thank you. So to start to orient you to my lingo, I have a few key terms which I'm just going to sketch here, and then we'll return to several times over the course of the hour. So the vice-mental disorder relationship I've already mentioned. It's a broad reference to the domain of interest in this book. Vice has a particular technical meaning for me in this book. It refers to wrongful, immoral, or criminal conduct and behavior. So while it does incorporate, I don't know if you do this in England, but or Scotland, we talk about the Vice Squad, which is addressed with, you know, is focused on arresting sex workers and drug dealers in the US, but my concept of vice is much broader, as you can see. Vice-laden concepts are concepts whose meaning entail elements of wrongfulness or immorality. Folk metaphysical assumptions is a central idea in my account, and it refers to the everyday presuppositions that everyone holds that naively take for granted about the nature of reality, the good, and being in existence. And you'll understand more about this as we go on. Social welfare is pretty much what you might expect. It's the collective of socio-political efforts to promote general human flourishing through education and assistance to the impoverished, individuals with intellectual disabilities, mental illness, and the child and adult criminal offenders and their victims. And then the Enlightenment split is something you're probably not familiar with, although maybe intuitive for you as it was for me, is my historical interpretation of a momentous change in Western social attitudes, institutions, and policies toward madness and immorality, which developed in the 16th century and forward. Next slide. So the exploration of the vice-mental disorder relationship, or VMDR, was guided by these sample questions. And again, these are all ones that I'm going to address in greater or lesser fashion. So it always drives me crazy for speakers to inundate me with questions and then not answer them. But these are I'm going to address. So how are conceptions of madness, mental disorders, immorality, and criminality used in our culture? And when I talk about our culture, I'm pretty much talking about Western English-speaking culture. How do these concepts overlap, and how are they distinct? What practical significance do they have? Some disorders in the DSM and ICD are vice-laden, others aren't. Why? Do vice-laden conditions belong in psychiatry and mental health, or are they really don't have much at all to do with mental illness? Why did madness and mental illness and immorality and criminality come to be predominantly distinct psychological and practical domains in Western culture? How does the VMDR fit into the task of social welfare today? And VMDRs are macro, can have wide effects as well as micro, having smaller, local, more limited effects. How do we respond to problems involving both the macro and micro levels? Next slide. So here I turn to the section now on the intellectual history of madness and morality. And so this is, in terms of page count, it's the biggest part of the book. I really failed to find any encompassing history that was really going to inform directly the relationships between, archaic concepts of madness, which I'm using the old term, and morality over millennia, much less recent centuries. So I had to find my own way, and so that's what I did. So these two chapters are longest, and I can't summarize them, obviously. I found that historical timelines were helpful in tracking the coincidence of events between the development of morality on the one hand, and then the development of the madness on the other. So I'll show you the timelines that I developed that are linked in the book to an online site for reference, and you'll see how rich and complex these are. I consider how a concepts of madness and morality developed from prehistory to the present, that is, ending in the late 20th century. So I was particularly interested in the metaphysical assumptions associated with the evolution of these concepts of madness and morality. That is, what are the concepts of being and what is real behind these concepts. And using the timelines I constructed, I can make a few comments. Next slide. So here's the first page of the timeline, going back to prehistory and then into heading into the medieval era. Just to give you a flavor, it's probably unreadable on your side. So for example, left of 3,000 years BC, skulls on the madness timeline, skulls with trepanation holes, or trephination sometimes called, around 6,500 BC, were found in France. These are believed to be used to permit the escape of evil spirits. And interestingly, some of those skulls, the trephination windows, were healed over, suggesting that the patient or the individual survived the procedure in order to heal bone. So that's and then down below at the bottom, the first Mesopotamian cities appear, leading to property inheritance, and beer and wine making developed. And so the concept of property turns out to be closely linked to concepts of morality, as we'll see over the centuries. Go on to the next slide. You're seeing, as over the millennia here, culture is now becoming more complicated, even in this relatively narrow, dual circumscribed area. And so as we go through dark ages into post-modernity and onto the present. The next slide. So that's your little taste of the intellectual history part. It was, I have to say, among the most fun parts of the book, and I learned so much. The third section has to do with the vice-mental disorder relationship and what does it have to do with psychopathology and classification, picking up some of the themes from values in psychiatric diagnosis. So much of the conceptual critique of the DSM classifications from Vapid 1 is restated or summarized in Vapid 2. This included things like identifying and distinguishing vice-laden mental disorders from others, calling out vice-laden diagnostic categories and criteria by examples. So for example, a classic example is psychopathy or antisocial personality disorder, or pedophilia, another victimizing mental disorders. I identify in VAPID-2, identified some sample Western cultural roots of vice-laden categories. This was a lot of fun. From these sources, I have the 7 deadly sins listed on the sign image on the lower left side of the screen. And it's interesting to trace the correspondences between the 7 deadly sins, and some of them apply, but not all, to common psychopathological categories. And I'll let your imagination run wild with that. Impoverished DSM criteria sets. It turns out when I examined vice-laden categories, these were common flaws in the DSM particular. So as you know, some criteria sets in the DSM, for example, for schizophrenia are very detailed with lots of required as well as variable diagnostic criteria. When you turn to, for example, the paraphilias, they're very much lacking in any sort of phenomenological description. And disorders that are vice-laden or wrongful conduct-laden tended to exhibit this, with a good exception being, though, antisocial personality disorder, which they really went to town with, of all the ways that you could be bad. The troubled validity of vice-laden monosymptomatic disorders. And so it turns out a lot of the vice-laden disorders, but paraphilias among others, were derivatives of Esquirol's monomanias, adapting many of them, but not all, which is also its own puzzling question. So, for example, why did kleptomania persist into the 21st century, and why didn't homicidal insanity monomania persist into the 21st century? So that's something that I also explore in the book. We talk about vice-laden disorders as primary or secondary or due to other conditions as well. Next slide. That's Esquirol, the picture. In terms of more on this, there are also what I call conspicuous omissions in candidate vice-laden behavioral syndromes in the sort of literature around vice-laden behavioral syndromes. So the set of current vice-laden categories in the DSM and ICDs viewed from the history of madness morality turned out to be quite idiosyncratic. So I just mentioned, for example, kleptomania is in, pyromania is in, but homicidal insanity is out. Why? This prompted the need to articulate omissions of vice-laden diagnostic categories. Such omissions were deemed vice-laden behavioral syndromes. So in the 20th century and into the 21st, there's some good examples of that in the literature of proposed disorders that were vice-laden, never made it into a formal diagnosis. Famous one from DSM-3R is paraphilic coercive disorder, also known as paraphilic rapism. Pathological bias, also known as racism, as a mental illness. Behavioral addictions, which are still being wrangled over, gambling being the exemplar, and sexual addictions as what I call the provocateurs. And then another one, political apathy disorder. These prompted then the potential for other potential categories, using some imaginative play with colleagues about potential vice-laden disorders. And probably things like this have been discussed amongst mental health professionals in the pubs over in the UK as well. Next slide. And some of these are, for example, criminal profiling findings used in the US FBI, strongly scientifically based, pretty narrow sets of clinical features. For example, serial murderers, why not mental disorder around that? A colleague of mine proposed white collar anti-sociality as being a conspicuous omission from the DSM. That is, raising the question of why do vice-laden disorders over-identify the urban poor in the DSM antisocial personality disorder criteria. I mentioned the 7 deadly sins. Sloth and gluttony disorders are inspired by 2 of them. The then emerging category of binge eating disorder was 1, and the AMA declaring obesity as a disease about 10 years ago now. And of course, now we have anti-obesity drugs and so forth. Pathological industry, describing individuals who overwork to chronic distress, heavily overlapping with the extensively researched and documented burnout syndrome. Perhaps the DSM authors would rather not heal themselves. Next slide. So now we turn to the law and criminal justice perspectives on the VMDR. And so while I'm going to refer to a lot of criminal law events in the UK, I have to say that most of my discussion is focused on US criminal law and criminal justice systems. But I'll be interested in your response to my use of some of the key developments in British law. So it considers interrelated topics in VAPID 2, one on criminal law, one on criminal procedure in the criminal justice system, including models of criminal justice, policing, penology, parole, probation, and relationships with the mental health system. Chapters 4 and 5 provide significant background to this discussion. So, for example, up until the late medieval period, wrongful conduct associated with madness and morality, the latter as religiously, identified as sin, were intermingled as manifestations of demon possession or punishment from gods. The Enlightenment split, which I'm going to talk about in a minute more, sorted social deviance into 2 broad kinds: sin, addressed by the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, and Judaism, and the relatively new concept of crime, which was cast as offenses against the polity, hence falling under law. So again, this is at the very early, 16th, 17th century Enlightenment period. Madness, in turn, was split off in the post-Enlightenment era of social deviance and was inherited by the new sciences of medicine and psychiatry. Madness came to be an illness. More on this later. So now we can start to see some of the rough answers to the question is, why are some vice-laden mental disorders, why did they not make it into psychiatry? It's standard mental disorders, because they've been sequestered by metaphysical assumptions, both on the part of the new doctors as well as the religious and emerging criminal justice law. Next slide. So here's my sketch. Can you see the full blue square down to the bottom? Mine's a little cut off. There you go. That's good. Thank you. So madness, in terms, was split off from pre-Enlightenment social deviance, and it was inherited by the new science, medicine, and psychiatry as the Enlightenments unfolded. So during the medieval era, roughly 1000 to 1600 AD, the view of madness was of demon possession or God's punishment. The social control was largely by the church and the community. The view of what today we would call criminal wrongdoing was of sin, and social control was again exerted by the church and community. in the Enlightenment, this started to change, and the view of madness increasingly became cast as sickness or disease and a disturbance of nature. In that case, then, the social controls were medicine, the methods were science, treatment, and prevention. And the view of criminal wrongdoing, in contrast, persisted as sin, as a failure of morality. The social control was still operated by the church, and the methods then and now were worship, education, and threat, that is, of eternal damnation and like. With the Enlightenment split, medicine and later psychiatry inherited madness, explained by the scientific causality and treated as disease, while criminal and common law inherited wrongful conduct or sin, explained by failure of faith or to resist temptation, and treated as a moral failing with punishment. Now, today we have this mishmash of these concepts. In popular culture, oftentimes embrace both viewpoints, as we'll see later in the book and to some extent in this presentation. Next slide. So this cultural segregation of law and morality from medicine and psychiatry is accompanied by distinctive folk metaphysical assumptions. That is, again, these assumptions about the nature of reality that everyone holds in everyday life. The historical development of the Enlightenment split leads to the founding and emerging differentiation of social welfare institutions familiar today, namely the criminal justice system, the mental health system, the juvenile justice system, and schools and institutions for intellectually disabled people. The whys behind these developments are big stories in themselves, and again, part of the mystery story elements of this book, which was fun to develop. In this context, I needed a concept of folk metaphysical assumptions to understand the presuppositions involved in the respective meta-institutions. So what were the presuppositions around law and religion, and what are the presuppositions around science, medicine, and psychiatry? Next slide. So the key metaphysical assumptions in Western law and religions are individualism. That is, the core ontologic unit is the individual person, which is linked then to personal responsibility, emerging from Abrahamic salvation being for individuals only. That is, people don't get admitted into the kingdom of heaven on the group plan. It's only individuals. In order to be responsible and enter the kingdom of heaven, individuals have free will. And so free will is a concept built into Abrahamic religions. Wrongdoing and free will implicate the ancient idea of just deserts, where wrongdoers receive what they deserve. And this goes back again to the very beginnings of morality with lex talionis, that is the eye for an eye, that is truly ancient. Sort of moral attitude. Collectively, these together constitute the folk metaphysical foundations for Western retributive or punishment-oriented criminal justice systems. In short, I call these Abrahamic folk metaphysical assumptions, or Abrahamic FM assumptions for short. These frame the reality about wrongdoing for us, and it's easy to take for granted and hard to suspend or substitute other folk metaphysical assumptions. Next slide. So what about science, medicine, and psychiatry? What are their folk metaphysical assumptions? Science, medicine, and psychiatry live by a different set. These include the idea of an ordered, understandable universe, causal relationships between events that are multiple and complex, what I call complex multi-causal, or CMC, folk metaphysical assumptions. CMC assumptions undermine free will, leading contemporary philosophers, as well as neuroscientists, to debate the existence of and justifications for free will. Without free will, the notion of individual responsibility crumbles, and the credibility and justification of retributive justice, that is, punishing individuals for crime, is seriously damaged. Without Abrahamic metaphysical assumptions, punishing wrongdoers seems mostly an expression of collective institutionalized vengeance. Under CMC folk metaphysical assumptions, individuals are not univocal responsible actors, but actors embedded in multi-causal networks of complex vectors, themselves recursively malleable, fluid, and complex with time and circumstance. CMC challenges metaphysical individualism as well. So chapter 6 on law and criminal justice fleshes out the implications here by examining the practice of criminal law, criminal justice, and medical psychiatric practice. Next slide. Okay, so the analysis of the VMDR in criminal law and justice is wide-ranging, prohibiting recounting of the arguments in a short time frame. Some illustrative points and comparisons can suggest where these analyses are going. One set of comparisons concerning the contrasting and often incompatible modes of thinking and reasoning between criminal law and medicine psychiatry. Criminal law is based on Abrahamic assumptions that I mentioned: responsibility, desert, individualism, free will. Psychiatry and medicine, however, are a little mixed up, sometimes based on Abrahamic FM assumptions and sometimes CMC FM assumptions. We are, in a word, confused. For example, in psychiatry and forensic setting, flops between these two standpoints and suffers for it. So, I mean, the obvious example, at least in the US, so for example, people with personality disorders are not given criminal excuse or so-called insanity defense, while people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder or brain injury disorders are often given criminal excuse. So sometimes we think about in terms of multi-causal complex causality. Other times we think in terms of Abrahamic FM assumptions. These then generate controversies between the two fields, for example, about the insanity defense, as I mentioned. And then in philosophy of psychiatry, you talk about the mad-bad problem. That is, are people with mental disorders bad, or are they mad? Next slide. Another facet of this analysis is the different ways of thinking in criminal law. There's too much here for me to go through, but let me just give you a sample. So, for example, we can think about criminal law and psychiatry both share interest in what evidence is and use evidence in their reasoning, correct? So we can think about practical interests in evidence. We can think about how the two fields evaluate evidence. We can think about how the two fields constrain evidence and how they address evidential bias. And so let me just skip to the latter as a sample. So in criminal law, in the US, we have the so-called adversary system, which provides an ongoing advocacy approach to how evidence is used, depending on which side you're on. Criminal procedure provides regulatory norms and oversight to diminish bias. And then the rules of evidence are given in particular guidance on use of evidence. In psychiatry, it's very different from medicine and psychiatry. Social elements of scientific process, that is, shared values of peer review and objectivity and so forth. Peer review and consultation is offered to explicitly address bias in scientific or medical claims. And there are regulatory structures, professional associations which provide ethics rules and conflict of interest rules. Next slide. We can also see how interpretation, which both law and psychiatry depend upon, can be really structurally different in the two fields. Criminal law interpretation is emergent, that is, the jury interprets from a courtroom process. It's definitive once the jury obtains a verdict that finalizes the interpretation, and then it's singular. So only one interpretation prevails. That is, we can't have two verdicts, or three or four. In psychiatry, interpretation is ongoing, and as health and disease is a continuous unfolding process. It's pluralistic. We have valid interpretations in multiple ways of reasoning. We talk about the biopsychosocial model and reasoning from psychological evidence and biological evidence and so forth. And it's evolutionary. That is, our understanding of our patients develops over time as we collect more experience and information about them. Next slide. So after acknowledging the US's horrific problem of incarcerating mentally ill people, especially poor and minority ones, I turn to analyses of what the courts and the criminal justice system want. So what do they want? So my criminal law attorney friends helped me with this. Lawyers in criminal courts want a persuasive performance from a psychiatrist. They want clarity about what mental disease and defect is. They want sharp boundaries of impairment. They want an assessment of criminal intent and blameworthiness, and they want crisp determination of causes of illnesses and particular behaviors. Next slide. So what does the criminal justice system want from psychiatric diagnosis? They want mechanisms for behavior control. They want prediction of future offending and opportunities for rehabilitation, therapeutics, and recovery, that is, to reduce reoffending. Well, here in the last section, that these goals are problematic within a punitive, retributive criminal justice system, and that alternative models such as therapeutic jurisprudence and restorative justice are needed not just to be humane, but also to be effective in reducing reoffending and protecting the public. Next slide. So now we turn to the public interest perspectives. And again, my apologies for this whirlwind nature of this. I hope it doesn't have the paradoxical effect of saying, oh my God, I'm going to skip this one. This chapter is mostly a review of public attitudes to mental illness, crime, and their relationships, and comparing to reality as defined by research scientists. Research on public attitudes toward crime, criminals, mentally ill people, and mentally ill offenders. What are the attitudes? How do they come about? An important background concept comes from the American educator E.D. Hirsch, who articulated the concept of cultural literacy. And cultural literacy is the background knowledge required to understand new text. And in his particular interest case, the canon of English literature. For example, in order to understand the US Civil War text about Lee and Grant, one would need to have some prior knowledge about who Lee and Grant are. He did empirical studies to demonstrate the important role of background knowledge in college students understanding novel texts. In the decades following, related public literacies about background knowledge needed to understand new text emerged. And so most relevantly for me are health literacy, criminology and crime literacy, and mental health literacy, which have all been studied in social science. Next slide. I consider these various literacies and their literatures, which in terms of research interest, provoke a perspective on public understanding. So first of all, the numbers of publications in the various literacies vary by the kind of literacy. So health literacy is a huge literature, mental health literacy, not so much, crime literacy, even less, and almost nothing on criminology literacy. Not only is scholarly interest in crime and criminology literacy very low, these data predicted correctly that public attitudes and knowledge of crime and criminology findings would be the lowest. The details of public attitudes and their measurement are very interesting, albeit complex and difficult to present succinctly. Some general trends, next slide. In surveys about the ability to recognize signs of mental illness in oneself and others, the literacy level is low. In an influential and big WHO study, across countries around the world, people with anxiety, depressive, and substance abuse disorders sought treatment within 1 year only, at best 52% of the time, and at worst 2% of the time. Members of the public are often suspicious of mental health care and individuals with mental illness, thinking the latter are dangerous and sexually licentious. People with mental illness are most likely to take a vacation, seek help from friends or family, see a minister, see their family doctor, see a psychologist or social worker, and I'm sorry to say, in last place, see a psychiatrist. Psychiatrists are often simultaneously viewed as therapeutic, impotent, and threatening. So there's one that's confusing. The findings of mental health literacy research are quite humbling for us. Next slide. Regarding crime and criminal offenders, the US criminology data is very interesting and still relevant to today's headlines and posturing by politicians. For example, a large majority of the US public, nearly every year since 1989, believe that crime has increased from the previous year. The research shows since 1992, both violent and property crime have steadily decreased worldwide, though in recent years this trend has slowed, although it's still decreasing. Attitudes toward the mentally ill are negative. One influential study identified mentally ill people compared to most people as most dangerous, more unpredictable, more violent, more mysterious, more ignorant, more sexually driven. Next slide. Public knowledge and beliefs and attitudes about crime, mental illness, and their relationships. Some general findings. Mentally ill offenders are doubly stigmatized, viewed more negatively by the public than mentally ill people and most people. Triple stigma is a concept in the literature, which means mental disorder plus criminal offender plus substance abuse disorder. And as you might imagine, they suffer the most from triple stigma. Insanity defense are not guilty by reason of insanity. The vast majority of the public overestimate both its use and defense and its efficacy. So I have a little box there that you're probably looking at. Probably the best single study of public perception virtual action versus the actual use of not guilty by reason of insanity. Next slide. Whys. Why are we have these perceptions? Many studies use different methods. This is difficult social science to do. Yes, individuals with serious mental illness are slightly more likely to commit violent crimes compared to the general population. This risk increases when substance abuse is added to the mix. However, people with serious mental illness are much more likely to be victims of violent crime than perpetrators. Significant set of confounds is the heavy overlap between causal vectors of criminal offending and causal vectors of serious mental illness. Are individuals with mental disorders other than serious mental illness and substance abuse more likely to commit violent crime? There are virtually no studies or no significant empirical knowledge of this. What about nonviolent crime? Again, little is known. Next slide. There we go. So this is a sky view of the Dallas County Jail, the Lou Sterrett Justice Center, which is the largest mental health facility in Dallas County by numbers of people served. Just as the sad fact for you. So we should talk about criminalization of the mentally ill. Studies are few, but trends support the Penrose hypothesis, e.g. that hospital beds are inversely proportional to incarceration rates. That is, the more robust your availability of hospital beds, the less incarceration there is. The pathways from experiencing homeless to criminal incarceration are well established, especially when adding serious mental illness and substance abuse. I've already mentioned about Lou Sterrett. Next slide. Most social science research that addresses causes of public misperceptions of vice mental disorder relationships comes from mental health literacy research and media studies, the impact of pop media on public attitudes. As you might imagine, negative portrayals prevail. Here's Clint Eastwood in his Dirty Harry role, getting ready to shoot the punk to make his day, and then Stallone saying crime is a disease and he's the cure, which is, of course, then shooting the guy. Next slide. There are more empathic views, such as this one from Gandhi. All crime is a kind of disease and should be treated as such. Next slide. Most social science research that addresses causes of public misperceptions of VMDRs come from these media studies. Negative portrayals prevail and are well established, as I've given you just a little teeny tiny sample of the movies out there. More empathic, multidimensional views of criminality are uncommon. What importance are stereotypes in actually shaping public attitudes? It's unclear. Negative portrayals fulfill viewpoints about what is newsworthy. Their stereotypic image of the mad criminal offender as a relentless psychopath without anxiety, vulnerabilities, or disorganization is ubiquitous in Western culture. So my wife and I are fans of the BBC, crime TV shows, and again, it's the rare image of the criminal offender experiencing anxiety and overwhelmed stress, although there are some good exceptions in the BBC shows. Next slide. Conclusions and policy implications. The following gives away the solutions to the nonfiction mystery story I posed. I'd want to talk first about the 11 features of folk metaphysics, which distinguish them from philosophical metaphysics and distinguish folk metaphysics from philosophical metaphysics, which is a formal inquiry. So folk metaphysics differs from philosophical metaphysics in that folk metaphysics is unsystematic, it's naive, that is, it takes things for granted. It's partially and variably shared. It's related to it being culture bound in the anthropological notion there. It's normatively powerful, which means it's very folk metaphysical assumptions are very compelling in terms of our everyday conduct. They're built into institutions, like, for example, laws. They underwrite the sciences. No scientist can conduct their work without believing in causality, for example. Common sense, they're commonsensical and intuitive. Everyone uses them. Philosophers may question them, and of course, they're deeply assumed. Next slide. Chapter 8 spells out how folk metaphysical conflict shapes perennial conceptual problems. I mentioned that people with psychotic illness are excused from personality and more eligible for the insanity defense than people with personality disorders, addictions, paraphilias, conduct disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, for example. Many people consider their disordered mental distress as their own fault or just deserts from their prior misbehavior. Our current social welfare efforts educate, punish, treat, rehabilitate, ostracize, and seclude, a mashup of both folk metaphysical traditions. Juvenile delinquency, is it bad or bad? Intellectual disabilities, do we treat them or do we educate them? Wild inequities in federal funding in the United States for mental health versus criminology and criminal justice research. And the near complete lack of communication and collaboration between criminal justice rehabilitation efforts and psychiatric rehabilitation efforts is just remarkable when you come to recognize this. This leads to redundant and negligent services and therefore more expensive social welfare, which is, of course, very lean to begin with. Next slide. My prevailing conclusion, the peculiar bundle of contradictions which describes the current VMDR is in large part a cultural artifact of prevailing conflicts and incompatibilities between complex multi-causal CMC scientific metaphysical assumptions and Abrahamic folk metaphysical assumptions. This conclusion leads in Chapter 8 to a proposal for a mixed model of rehabilitation, which combines elements of criminal rehabilitation and psychiatric rehabilitation tailored to the needs of individuals. The rehabilitation model of the VMDR is my proposal about how we should respond. Next slide. The final chapter summarizes my conclusions and provides a brief clarification about punishment, where I acknowledge the inevitability of some elements of punishment for any compelled program. My principle being that punitive elements be minimized. For example, or regarding folk metaphysical assumptions, my recommendation is not that Abrahamic FM assumptions are wrong or incorrect, but rather their retributionist applications have not served us well in the background of our understandings of criminality and prevention of reoffending. Instead, we should choose and cultivate CMC FM assumptions in our handling of the VMDR. The ramifications of the VMDR are organized into 40 theses, which constitute the bulk of the last chapter. These are both prescriptions for social action and policy, as well as calls for new research from various disciplines. Next slide. Some highlights. They address the role of various constituent disciplines: philosophy, mental health, law and social policy, psychopathology, and forensic correctional psychiatry. I can't cover all of them, obviously, but I'll mention a few cross-cutting ideas. A key concept or insight is the shift from regarding wrongful criminal thought and behavior as some sort of distinct species of behavior, and toward regarding immorality and criminality as just another variety of problematic human behavior and experience on the same metaphysical playing field with traditional psychopathology. Wrongful behavior is warranting our care, not our vengeance. Next slide. Philosophers of psychiatry and mental health are practiced at distinguishing disordered mental functions from normative ones, such as normal and pathological anxiety or normal and pathological mood. Likewise, under CMC FM assumptions, they can study normal and pathological morality, distinguishing ordinary misconduct from disordered misconduct. So for example, here would be distinguishing kleptomania from ordinary shoplifting. Like the consideration of implicit and explicit values were so transformative for psychiatric research, theory, and practice 30 years ago, the analysis of folk metaphysical assumptions can transform our thinking about current and ongoing conceptual issues in psychiatry and mental health, such as the ones I do here in the Vice book. Next slide. Forensic psychiatry and forensic criminology change. Forensic psychiatrists no longer participate as expert witnesses participating in punishment for the guilty, but instead are experts in rehabilitation services for offenders, whether healthy or disordered. A new identity for forensic criminologists is expert testimony in trials in retributional courts. The reason for favoring forensic criminologists over forensic psychiatrists is forensic psychiatrists have an obligation to do no harm, and forensic criminologists don't. Moving toward restorative and other alternative criminal justice models requires a free society, civil liberties, and public accountability by those rehabilitating offenders. Mental health and crime prevention become targets of synergistic and robust public health efforts. Public education on mental health, including moral mental health, is widely developed, promoted, and administered. Research on immoral criminal conduct is widely expanded, robustly funded, and integrated with mental health research. Next slide. The DSM and future diagnostic systems incorporate morality as another mental function, as cognition, affection, conation long have been. Criminologists join the mental health team along with psychiatrists, psychologists, social workers, and the rest. I note that some of these 40 theses are short-term transitional recommendations that is more implementable in a practical way, while others are more idealized and long-term goals. Hopefully my concluding section on objections or responses will be raised in our discussions to come today. I conclude here. Next slide. And here's some pictures of Dallas, of various places and buildings and whatnot. So we can take down the slides and we can chat for whatever time is left. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks very much. I think it's clear just how, I mean, the sheer volume of work that's gone into this is quite incredible, and the kind of scope of the book is yeah is really impressive. As usual, I have lots of questions, but I'll start by just opening it up to the floor and invite um people to turn their cameras on if they are willing and able. And if anybody does have a question but doesn't feel confident speaking out, they can type it and I will read it for them. So thank you very much, Professor Sadler. And any questions? Yes, Peter.
Yeah, I started this by saying I would try not to speak. I'll try not to speak much because my voice isn't working well. It's a relatively simple question. I find that a fascinating overview. Must now go and read the book. But I also found myself just immensely depressed at the depth of your knowledge, the power of your argument when you're living and working in a country where any kind of science seems to be now simply to be decried and ignored. I am, of course, talking about primarily Robert Kennedy Jr., but the entire administration, which it seems to me within your context works entirely on the so-called common sense kind of folk understandings, and would decry any attempt to make any kind of deeper or more rational analysis. Please tell me I'm at least partially wrong.
I actually, in the last paragraph of the book, I addressed this, that in some ways my book is published in a time that is not friendly to it. And I don't see that as much of a reason to not do it. As I mentioned in the presentation, I make a big point about in terms of the 40 theses, I really see them as some of them being very idealistic and pragmatically unrealizable in the present day, while others could represent small incremental changes, even including, I mentioned earlier about the micro and the macro. So they're both micro and macro suggestions and proposals in the 40 theses. And the other thing is, the nice thing about books is they hang around. Even when they're burned, there's always some left. So again, I'll be 72 next month. And so I just need to, get the work out and let it play. And however way it goes, I won't be around to find out anyway. I don't know if that's much of an answer to you, Peter, but.
And Douglas, yes, thank you.
Yeah, no, I was just wondering how much you think public perception would be changed dramatically if in psychiatry we had decent tests for illnesses. I'm thinking of epilepsy, for example. People with committing crimes in an epileptic fit, it's well defined, isn't it? When the fit is responsible, the person isn't, because you can measure the spikes and waves on the EEG, and that's viewed as evidence. I mean, if we had a test for schizophrenia like that, or a genetic marker that was, 100% certain,
Yeah.
would that not change everything, including
Well, I
public?
think that would be powerful, and that's hence my call for robust, funding. One of the central ironies of your question, Douglas, is in my discussion of the diagnostic criteria for conduct disorder in the DSM. And if you look at the diagnostic criteria, every single one of the diagnostic criteria is basically describing a wrongful or criminal conduct. Lying, skipping school, stealing, et cetera, et cetera. It's just one after the next. The irony that I alluded to was one of the authors on the committee was I forget her name, a neuropsychologist who built her career doing extensive neuropsychological studies of children that come under the rubric of conduct disorder, and virtually all of them have serious and fairly stereotypic neurocognitive impairments, notably the ability to recognize and express emotions in oneself and others. So that was her finding. It never found its way into the diagnostic criteria. And that little fact is so insight generating into what to do with these kids.
I just wanted to ask, in terms of the sort of notable omissions of vice-laden behavioral syndromes that plausibly could have ended up in our nosology, but didn't, whilst others have. Did you get a sense of whether that was in any way systematic? Was it sort of entirely idiosyncratic in how that's come about? Is it just the sort of historically contingent nature of our diagnostic system, or was there more of a sense that there were more systemic factors at play that might have influenced what went in and didn't?
What didn't? Yeah. So that in some ways goes back to values in psychiatric diagnosis, and about how I can't speak for the ICD, but I can, study the DSM developmental processes. And, what's significant there is, it's a group of, it's a series of committees that are sorted by disorder group, and it's led by the DSM lead. And what counts, what gets in or gets out, is based on a variety of criteria, some of which are published, some of which probably aren't. But probably one of the requirements is that there be some scientific literature to validate the category. And so when someone comes in with pathological bias as a proposal, or political apathy disorder as a proposal, it may ring familiar to our clinical experiences, but chances are it's not going to be taken very seriously by the DSM committees just on the basis of its face validity, is the term for it, that they'll want to have some sort of research record accompanying it. Now, I'm making it sound super rational and super scientific. There's also all kinds of biases and preferences and prejudices that get into the mix that's gone into, it's all discussed or mostly discussed in in values in psychiatric diagnosis. Does that answer your question?
It does. I look forward to reading it. Christos, yes. Hi, thank you.
You're muted.
You're on mute.
Yes, very interesting. I had a number of thoughts listening to you. I'll try and share 1.5 of them. So I think what came for me very strongly was a kind of a question of life and lifelessness, sort of an active and living personal elements, and those disowned, made other, made affliction and fate instead of the results of one's own choices. And the problem of criminality and surface understanding over a true depth of feeling and acknowledgement of ongoing, perhaps for lack of a better word, spiritual warfare. So, but there is a part of a self that looks at something and energetically valence wants to destroy it, whether it's within ourselves or when we project it onto others. We just want it gone. It's intolerable to us. And that's a position that we take by identifying too strongly with one side and solely with one side and splitting and creating, if you would like, conflict. And so these are the sort of issues that that are problematic. And I think it's an illness to look at the other as a mechanism, as an automaton. It's to take away their livingness, to look at them as some sort of machine or biologically kind of structured object in movement, as if they had no meaning, no personal, face to face in a kind of Levinas sense, real kind of depth to them, that they couldn't choose nothing, they couldn't choose anything. And I mean, I've worked quite a bit with learning disabilities as well, and I know there's choice. There's always choice. Even in people with profound learning disabilities, there's choice, let alone in people that have, near normal or normal intelligence. So it's an interesting kind of take. Yes, of course, there's some things that we cannot know, but there's many things that we do not want to know. And you mentioned cognitive difficulties. I mean, avidya has been a sort of ignorance in the kind of Hindu canon and the Buddhist kind of canon that grew out of it is a core issue. So it's not like it's a characteristic that is immutable. No, but also it's not a characteristic that's just happened. So it's something to do with the development of the self and the encouragement of the self to know and to be responsible. So there's a mixing there, I think, of different, if you'd like, ideologies that probably needs more working. And actually, I'll share something. One of the things that made a great impression on me was one of your compatriots, Mike Tyson. And he, of course, had a very kind of long history of competitiveness. And I remember watching a video of his saying, if someone does you wrong, if disrespects you, or, how do you deal with it? He was very clear that you mustn't fall into the trap of returning like with like, because then that would mean that, they got you in their trap, the people that disrespect you. So that he should always sort of, keep their distance and not react, not give pleasure, if you would like, to, as he saw it, and I think probably had some good grasp of it, the joy of seeing the suffering of others. Some could call it evil, some could call it just, a regular day, for some people. So there's something to it. And Gandhi says all crime is a disease and should be treated as such. But how does one treat a disease? Ultimately, it's by eliminating it. So the real issue for me is that is exactly the sort of tropes that most readily led to ethnic cleansing in California, Sweden, Germany, and Russia. So I think keeping some level of and trying to grow the level of personal responsibility, I think, is key. And if that means that, we treat some people harshly, I think that's better than treating everyone badly. But that's my take. So I would love to hear your thoughts. I'm not going to mention the other one, actually. I've already said too much. So looking forward. Thank you.
I appreciate your comments. I think I mostly agree with what you're suggesting. A couple of thoughts or reactions to it. The concept of free will is something that demands a philosophical as well as a scientific understanding, because we all have the experiences of making choices and rejecting others and being in situations where the possibilities are multiple. And we also have the experience of compulsion, that is, where we can't help ourselves, which are relatively rare. And then the experiences of restricted choice, and then wide open possibilities and everything in between those. And so that's a whole other discussion that I even mentioned it. That's the literature demands from philosophy as well. I have my own thoughts about it, about how to assimilate what we call free will into a complex multi-causal account. And I can't go into it, but one of the things I can say is that the way I think about free will and CMC metaphysical assumptions is that free will, the argument there's no free will because everything is determined, is false. And the reason why there is no strong determinism is because randomness occurs throughout all of nature, including the brain, including the weather, including the movement of light, through the cosmos and so forth. So randomness is sort of the germ of free will in a complex causal system. And so that's the sort of thing that needs to be worked out. The other thought that I had is that when you're originally talking about the aggressive impulse, I mean, it's truly ancient. I mean, it goes back to prehistory. I mentioned Lex talionis is a good example. And so it's ubiquitous. I think it's part of what the nature of being human is. That doesn't mean it's something that we should, accept or not try to modulate in some way. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I've just shared in the group, there's a nice debate from two authors who recently published a book within the last few years. So I've just Kevin Mitchell is one of them, one of the authors who very much takes a CMC type approach. So there's a link in the group there. David, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Oh, let's see if I can sort of phrase this fairly briefly. I was delighted. No, I have to get the book. So thank you very, very much, John, for putting so much into this and achieving so much breadth in the what you've laid out here, and particularly coming back to a phrase which I think ought to be that psychiatry ought to have a very good look at, which is philosophical anthropology, and which I think you touched on right at the start of your talk. And you said that your method was not to set out in an explicit way what your hypotheses might be in terms of philosophical anthropology. But right at the end of the talk, when you mentioned the theses, which have, I think, I don't know if they sort of reference a bit of a missionary zeal there, which I would get behind, because there is a generosity and a therapeutic ambition behind it. So that's good. But one of them, I think, says something about morality ought to be considered as another mental function alongside the mental functions like our affectivity and our conative characteristics, our willing.
Mhm.
So I guess coming back to the philosophical anthropology, I'm sort of thinking, what presumably you do have a theory of human nature. You've just used the phrase in your answer to the previous speaker, so the previous question, the nature of what it is to be human. And
Boy,
does
I
that
would
come
hate to
out?
say I have something systematic.
Right. But there is something presumably in the theses which is stating a philosophical anthropology, I
Mhm.
wonder. And I'm just wondering if you can get what stops you starting off in a more systematic way. Because you perhaps saying things which,
Yeah. It's because probably one of the reasons the book is so long is that I really didn't know what my conclusions would be at the
right,
beginning.
yeah,
And so just like the anthropologist is studying, the Zuni tribe in the American Southwest, they're interested in making their observations and being participants, so to speak, and then deriving their conclusions based on their observations. And that's pretty much what I did, except I didn't look at people, I looked at texts. Um, and so, like I said, when I first started out, at the end of Values in Psychiatric Diagnosis, my disposition, I even have some papers that suggest this. It's at meetings, this has been pointed out to me. At the end of Values in Psychiatric Diagnosis, I suggested that categories in the DSM that involved moral wrongfulness should be removed. And after doing this work, I have the 180-degree opposite viewpoint. Now that I feel like I understand the cultures better.
You're a convert.
Yeah, well, that's what's exciting about, I think, I also talk about philosophy can be about discovery, and I definitely had discoveries with this work.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm mindful of time. Does anybody have any final questions or queries?
You can put them in the chat, and if you'll send me, usually you can save the chat when you record. The chat will be a separate file. You can email it to me, and people would like to send me something separately, they're welcome to do that.
That's great. Well, listen, once again, thank you very much for a really fascinating and in-depth talk. I think it's been incredibly stimulating and interesting. So we really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, I'm so grateful. Like I said at the beginning, there's nothing better than having somebody pay attention.